My grandfather, Elias Thorne, held a secret for nearly 50 years. It was a truth so profound, so unbelievable, that he carried it with him in silence until the very end. He had befriended and protected an entire Sasquatch family. This was the most important relationship of his life. When he passed away recently, I received a cryptic note secretly from his attorney. It led me to a safety deposit box. Inside, there was only one thing: his personal journal. It was bound in worn leather and it smelled of pine and old sage. On the inside cover, he'd written a final instruction: do with this what you believe is right. This is the story from that journal, which he called the Cedar Ridge Keeper. Let's open it to the first entry. Journal entry: May 25th, 1973. The year 1973 was a time of transition. It's not just in the world, but in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest. What I witnessed this spring day changed the course of my life and gave me a burden of secrecy I carried for 5 decades. It's time I tell the story as my grandfather wrote in his journal. My name is Elias Thorne. I was 22 years old, fresh out of the University of Montana with a degree in ecology. I was a wilderness technician in training for the Teton Wilderness area in Wyoming. The scent of pine, dry sage, and glacial runoff was the air I lived for. My supervisor at the Jackson Peak Outpost, a quiet man named Frank Davies, gave me the standard rookie warning. These mountains are older than any of us, Elias. They hold secrets. Your job is to observe, document, and never, ever interfere with the wildlife if you can help it. The radio's spotty, and out here, you're on your own. I was prepared for wildlife, but not for what the wilderness truly held. A fateful event occurred in the late afternoon, around 4 p.m. I was meticulously documenting a rare patch of alpine sedge near an abandoned mining claim. This was in the rugged Silver Lode Canyon, about 7 miles off the main trail. The claim owners, a local outfitting family, had reported a devastating intrusion at their remote cabin, specifically their outbuilding, where they stored frozen game meat, venison, and bear from legal hunts, had been compromised. As I approached the clearing where the cabin sat, I immediately noticed the destruction. The heavy reinforced outbuilding door hadn't just been clawed or torn. It had been forcibly pried open. I don't know any wild animal that can do this. It was almost like a human had used a giant crowbar. But this was no human that did this. I sighed. I saw the true extent of the ruin. The large freezer unit had been completely busted into. Its lid was ripped clean off, and hunks of preserved meat were scattered everywhere. This level of destruction wasn't typical of bears. I'd seen bear damage plenty of times. Bears are messy, but this showed a brutal, deliberate destruction of the structure and the freezer. It hinted at a level of frustration or purpose that was deeply disturbing. But the scene on the ground told another story entirely. Large, deep impressions in the soft, loamy earth grabbed my attention. I knelt down, my photographer's eye instantly assessing the light and scale. I pulled out my field camera and my specialized measuring tape. The prints were immense, 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. They were vaguely human-like, with 5 distinct toe marks, but the size and depth were impossible for a human. Based on my calculations, whatever made them weighed well over 700 pounds. My heart began to pound a rhythm against the silent woods when the puzzle was being put together in my head of what this might be. These were not the prints of any known North American animal. They were the tracks of legend. I spent nearly an hour documenting the scene. I took detailed, bracketed photographs from every angle. I created plastered casts of the clearest prints and noted the astounding stride length, a regular 7-foot span between steps. My brain was in data collection work mode, but the instinctual part of me was vibrating every nerve with a growing sense of panic. The forest fell into a profound, unnatural silence that I had never heard. Then a guttural, groaning sound came from nowhere. A low, resonant, almost melodic vocalization that seemed to vibrate in the ground beneath me. It wasn't a growl, but a sound of immense power. It was coming from a thicket of scrub aspen about 50 yards away. My hiking boots began to back slowly toward my Jeep, which was parked on the gravel track. My Hasselblad camera hung ready around my neck, but my hands were locked, frozen. My eyes looking cautiously all around me with a feeling of dread and the need to run away, and then I saw it. Between 2 towering ponderosa pines, partially shielded by shadow, stood a figure. It was massive, easily 9 feet tall, covered in dark grayish-brown hair that seemed to shift with the fading light to a reddish-brown. Its shoulders were colossal, and it was observing me. I froze. My photographer's instinct screamed at me to raise the camera to capture the most important image in human history. But my muscles refused to obey. This was not a cougar, not a bear. This was an intelligent being. The creature made another, softer sound, almost like a question. Then, with a stunning, fluid motion, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I heard the sound of heavy, fast movement fading into the canyon. That was the first time I met the Sasquatch. It was the day my life split into two paths, the one everyone knew, and the one I kept hidden in the pages of this journal. What happened next would bond me to that creature and its family for the rest of my days. Back at the outpost, Frank took one look at my pale face and didn't even ask. He just poured me a cup of strong black coffee. I sat down and filed my official report. Property damage, I wrote. An unusual, large bipedal tracks, possibly a very large bear variety. But when Frank saw my detailed measurement, x18 inches long, humanoid, no claws, he grew still. These are accurate, he asked quietly. I nodded. Triple-checked them. He closed my notebook. Elias, he said, his voice low. Out here, we see things that don't fit the manuals. Document professionally and keep an open mind. There was a look in his eyes, a deep recognition, the weary gaze of someone who knew the same secret I now carried. In that moment, I understood I could never share the whole truth, not if I wanted to keep my career. But in my private journal, that was a different story. I sketched the creature from memory, writing down every detail of its staggering size, its impossible grace, and the shocking intelligence I saw in its dark eyes. Whatever it was real. And my professional curiosity was quickly becoming a full-blown obsession. I started varying my patrol routes, making sure to pass through the canyon as often as I could. It's turned into weeks. Then, on June 14th, 1973, the answer to my unspoken question finally came. I was near the claim, documenting a bird's nest, when I heard it again, that low, rumbling vocalization from the trees. This time I didn't run. I took a deep breath. I'm not going to hurt you, I called out, my voice shaky, feeling a bit foolish. I'm just a walker. No threat. The movement in the brush stopped. And then, the foliage parted. It stood at the edge of the scrub, only about 40 yards away. Its massive frame was clearer now in the gray daylight. It was every bit of 9 feet tall, with a heavy brow ridge and intelligent, cautious eyes that watched my every move. Slowly, deliberately, I sat down on a large boulder. I reached into my pack and pulled out a block of artisanal cheese and a crisp yellow apple, part of my lunch. Without standing, I gently tossed the apple about halfway between us. I don't know if you eat these, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but you're welcome to it. It stared at the offering on the ground, then back at me. Tense moment passed. Then it made a series of soft clicks and grunts. It was communicating. It moved forward. Its steps surprisingly quiet for its size, and stopped near the apple. But it didn't take it. Instead, it placed something on the ground. A branch laden with perfectly ripe, dark purple service berries. It was reciprocating. A gift for a gift, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. With shocking speed, it snatched the apple and retreated back into the cover of the trees. I picked up the branch and ate a service berry. It was sweet, bursting with flavor. I knew with absolute certainty this was not the end. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. Over the next few months, I met the creature whom I silently dubbed Kagan, which I decided meant Keeper of the Ridge, 6 more times. I started bringing specific offerings, fresh fruit, canned fish, and nuts. He always took the food, and often left gifts in return. Sometimes it was interesting pieces of jasper, other times river-polished stones or carefully arranged pine cones. We established a quiet bond of exchange and presence. By early 1974, Kagan was approaching within 10 feet of me. The fear was long gone, replaced by a profound sense of awe. One afternoon, he looked at me, and his eyes held an intelligence that carried a deep, ancient sadness. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it. And in that moment, I made a promise, soft but absolute. I won't hurt you, I vowed. I won't tell anyone. He made a soft sound in his throat, a low rumble of acknowledgement. And then, in a gesture so clear, I understood it instantly. He placed his enormous hand on the trunk of a nearby pine tree, then touched his own chest. Home, self. This is me. This is my home. It was in that moment I knew I had a solemn duty. This was not just a strange animal. This was a thinking, feeling being who had chosen to trust me with its very existence. Protecting this life and its secret became the most important mission of my life. When I returned to my cabin that evening, I gathered every piece of external evidence I had collected. The plaster casts of the footprints, the rolls of film from my Hasselblad camera, and all the loose, dated field notes detailing my encounters. The only thing I kept was my leather-bound journal. It's the one place I could hold the truth, not for the world, but for my own soul. I carried the rest of it to my small outdoor incinerator that was already burning furiously. With a deep and heavy heart, I burned everything. I watched as the smoke curled into the evening sky, consuming the last material proof of Kagan's existence. As the final plaster prints and photographic images turned to ash, I swore an oath to myself and to the silent woods. I would protect these precious creatures for the rest of my life. The years flowed by, turning into decades. I continued my work, my secret hidden deep within me. My bond with Kagan deepened. I learned his language not of words, but of subtle shifts in tone, of intentional gestures, of shared silence. It was a communication more profound than any I'd ever known. A few years later, I met his mate. I called her Lyra. She was smaller, more cautious. But eventually she came to accept my presence. And then, in the spring of 1995, something truly miraculous happened. I witnessed the birth and growth of their child, a small, curious creature I named Phelan, which means little star. I became a silent, trusted witness to their family. I observed their social structure, their quiet daily routines, and their deep vulnerability. They were a family, living a hidden life on the fringes of my world. My role was simple: to be a guardian, a quiet friend who asked for nothing but their continued secret existence. My life's work wasn't in the reports I filed or the surveys I completed. It was in the silence I kept, in the trust I earned, and in the profound, secret world I was privileged enough to be a part of. And it's a secret I will carry with me always. The turning point, the moment everything changed between us, was in the summer of 2003. I remember it like it was yesterday. The sun was high, filtering through the dense canopy of the old-growth forest. I arrived at our usual spot, a small clearing by a gurgling creek. Lugging a cooler filled with fresh salmon I'd caught that morning and a container of wild berries, I figured he'd appreciate the treat. Kagan was already there, but something was wrong. He wasn't waiting patiently in the shadows or observing from a distance as he usually did. He was hunched over near stream. He looked different, looking distressed. My first thought was that he was hurt. I set the cooler down and walked towards him, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. "Kagan?" I called out, my voice low. He heard me, of course. He stood up slowly, every movement seeming to take a monumental effort. He took a few steps, closing the distance until he was just 5 feet away. And then he did something he had never, ever done before. He turned his back to me. It was a gesture of complete and total trust, but also one of vulnerability. That's when I saw them. Parting the thick, coarse fur on his left side were 3 deep, parallel gashes running down his ribs. They were unmistakable scars, and they were fresh. The skin around them was still angry and inflamed. My heart sank. "Kagan, what happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, filled with a concern that went deeper than just curiosity. He turned to face me again, his dark, intelligent eyes locking onto mine. He stood tall, his immense frame seeming to fill the entire clearing. And then he began to tell me a story. Not with words, of course, but with the silent language we had developed over the years, a complex tapestry of gesture, expression, and a kind of intuitive understanding that defied explanation. He started with the deep history of his people. He pointed to himself, then swept a massive, long-fingered hand in a vast arc across the landscape, encompassing the mountains, the valleys, the ancient trees. The message was clear. His kind had been here since the mountains themselves were young, long, long before my people. The pale-skinned newcomers ever set foot on this continent. He was telling me about a time of deep history, a time of belonging that I could scarcely comprehend. This story takes place long before Columbus ever set foot on the Americas, if he ever did. Kagan described a first coming of white men who found gold. Sounded like 14th century Spaniards to me. That started the battle. I could be wrong. He narrated a history of what I can only call the Long War. It was a devastating, decades-long conflict every time these people came back for more gold. He conveyed a sense of profound sadness and loss as he described how it was driven by man's insatiable greed, a relentless lust for the land and its resources. He showed me their ancient fighting styles, how his people defended their homes. He mimed wielding a massive stone axe, its weight and power evident even in his gestures. He demonstrated how they used sharpened obsidian spears, striking with deadly precision from the shadows. His movements were fluid and powerful, conveying a sense of stealth, honor, and a desperate struggle to protect their territory. He then made a gesture that surprised me. He indicated that a very rare few, humans had fought alongside them. Allies. He depicted them as people who valued peace over profit, who saw the forest not as something to be conquered, but as something to be cherished. But his hands then fell, his expression turning to one of sorrow. These good humans, these allies, were also defeated, overwhelmed, and killed by the others. The story of the main human force was one of relentless, brutal aggression. He portrayed their fighting style not with honor, but with a kind of chaotic, unyielding anger that they enjoyed. He mimed the crack of their firearms, the superior weaponry that ultimately turned the tide. His gestures showed his people falling, not from a lack of courage, but from an enemy that fought without rules, without honor. The result was a total, crushing defeat. The Sasquatch were driven from their ancestral lands, forced into a permanent retreat deep into the most inaccessible parts of the wilderness. He conveyed a sense of a great council, a decision made by the survivors. They had witnessed man's enduring moral absence, our capacity for betrayal and destruction. And so, they made a choice. Fearing our nature, they chose eternal isolation, a self-imposed exile to ensure their survival. They would hide from us forever. And then, his story returned to the present. He pointed a trembling finger to the fresh, raw scars on his own side. His eyes held a flicker of the terror he must have felt. And then, he began to mime the event that had given him those wounds, showing me exactly what had happened in the recent past. It all made sense why he told me why they hide, because this experience was a terrifying echo of that ancient, brutal war where they almost went extinct. Kagan continued his story, his movements filled with a raw, intense passion. Showed me how he was tracking a wild hog, moving silently through the dense undergrowth, his body low to the ground. Then demonstrated crouching in a thicket of brush, completely hidden from view. He mimicked the arrival of 3 human figures, gesturing to the firesticks, the guns they carried. At that moment, he showed how the wild hog he'd been tracking appeared in the distance. But it was behind his hiding spot. The men turned, their excitement palpable at the sight of the prey. Kagan showed one man raising his gun to shoot the hog, but then disaster struck. Another man noticed the slight movement in the brush where Kagan was concealed. In a sudden frenzy, the second man raised his own gun and pointed it directly at Kagan. For Kagan, this was a moment of pure terror. He knew all too well what that firestick could do. The memory of what his kind called the Long War, the endless sounds of human gunfire, were deeply etched into their collective trauma. In that split second, Kagan didn't hesitate. He stood up violently, unleashing a terrifying, guttural roar that echoed through the entire canyon. The men were visibly startled, thrown off balance by the sheer power of the sound. Kagan turned and ran with the speed of a leopard. He showed me the man firing twice. The first shot missed, zinging past him. The second shot, however, wasn't so lucky. It grazed Kagan's shoulder, a searing, shocking impact. He stumbled, his powerful stride broken by the unnatural force of the bullet. The shock sent him reeling, and he lost his footing, falling headlong down a short, rocky ravine. As he tumbled, he showed how his side scraped violently against a large, broken tree branch, the jagged wood tearing deep gashes into his ribs. He landed in a heap at the bottom, hidden from their view. He lay there making low, pained sounds of distress, sounds the men could clearly hear from above. But the ravine was too steep, too treacherous for them to climb down. They couldn't confirm what they had shot. He lay perfectly still, listening to the men shouting in frustrated confusion. And in that moment, he knew he had survived, but just barely. These scars weren't just old wounds. They were a fresh, agonizing reminder that the ancient human hostility, that relentless impulse to shoot and claim still, reigns supreme in the world. After showing me the fall, Kagan looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of ancient pain and a very modern, immediate terror. He then did something that stopped my heart. He pointed to my face, then he pointed to his fresh, brutal scars. And then he made the gestures of my own approach over all these years, the camera I always carried, the peaceful offerings of food I left, the patience I had shown him time and time again. He was showing me the terrible truth of his kind's history and the immediate source of his own pain. And in doing so, he was asking me a profound question. Why was I different? Why do most people want to kill or hunt us? He knew that good humans existed, but in his experience, they were always the ones who were defeated or who disappeared. He was risking everything, laying his vulnerability bare, to see if I was one of the few who could be trusted. I couldn't hold it back anymore. Tears streamed down my face. "I'm so sorry, Kagan," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry for what they did to you, and for what my species has done to yours for generations." Kagan made a soft, low sound, and then he did something he had never, ever done before. He reached out one of his massive hands and gently, so gently, touched my shoulder. In that single moment of a fleeting gesture was a world of meaning. It was a fragile, cautious acceptance. Against the crushing weight of his kind's history, against the fresh, searing pain of his own wounds, he had chosen to trust my honesty. He had chosen to trust me. I knew my calling now, continued to protect these majestic beings. This was a bridge between two worlds, built on a foundation of sorrow. I became a relentless protector of the canyon, a guardian of its deepest secrets. To keep people away, I invented closures, reported false hazards, anything to create a barrier between the world and them. There were more and more Bigfoot hunters coming. I could feel the world closing in, its curiosity a constant threat. Then, in the autumn of 2013, I heard it. A call from beyond the creek low, trembling and full of a desperate urgency. I raced toward the sound, my heart pounding against my ribs, fearing what I would find. There, in a hidden grove, was the family. Kagan, Lyra, and little Phelan. My breath caught. Lyra was lying on the ground, her side matted with dark, wet blood. She had been shot. A hunting round was still lodged deep inside her, a chilling, nightmarish echo of the violence Kagan had just shown me in his silent plea. Without a second thought, I was at her side, uncapping my canteen. I began cleaning the wound with water and antiseptic from my small kit. Phelan watched my every move, her intelligent eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust. The wound was too serious. I needed more supplies to save her life. After securing the injury as best I could, wrapping it tightly, I looked at Kagan. His entire massive frame was tense with anguish. "I will be back in no time," I promised, my voice firm. "I promise." I raced back to my cabin, the forest a blur around me. I burst through the door, my mind focused only on getting the proper medical aid. But then I froze. On my kitchen counter, where nothing should have been, was a note, just for terrifying words. "Don't go back there." Someone knew my secret. My blood ran cold, a wave of ice washing over me. But there was no choice. I grabbed my full medical supplies, gauze, antibiotics, pain relievers in, drove my ATV back through the remaining darkness, pushing the fear down. Kagan met me halfway down the trail, frantic. He led me back to Lyra. I worked quickly, my hands steady, despite the adrenaline. I successfully cleaned and sutured her wound. Lyra's breathing steadied, her hold on life secured, though fragile, seemed to strengthen. The entire time, Kagan didn't watch me, or even Lyra. He watched the tree line, scanning the dark forest. He knew danger better than any of us. When I finished, He let out a soft sound, a rumble of pure gratitude. Phelan moved to her mother's side and gently pressed her forehead to Lyra's. The family huddled close, a small island of warmth in the cold woods, their breaths rising and falling as one. I was about to leave them to rest when a new sound shattered the quiet. A branch crack, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't an animal. 3 unsettling silhouettes emerged from the forest. Humans, they moved with clumsiness, and they carried rifles. Kagan rose to his full, towering height, a massive, silent wall between his family and the intruders. Lyra breathed shallowly behind him. My hand went to the handgun holstered at my hip. I drew it, the cold steel a familiar weight, and leveled it toward the men. "Please do not do this," I said, my voice quiet but shaking with resolve. "Leave." I took a breath. "You will have to shoot me to shoot them, and we have a hidden trail cam you will never find." This was a total lie. Frank Davies knows I am out here, and he is on his way. This was a lie too. "You know how much one of these is worth?" The leader spat on the ground. "This is not over." With that, they turned and melted back into the forest. The sound of their retreating boots faded, leaving an unnerving silence. Kagan looked at me, and in his eyes was a profound gratitude I had never seen in any creature, human or otherwise. "You have to go deeper," I whispered. "Farther into the high peaks? It isn't safe here anymore." Kagan's gaze shifted toward the canyons and mountains that he called his home. He understood. The family rose together, leaning into one another. A single, sorrowful silhouette against the pale sunset. Kagan reached out and touched the trunk of an ancient cedar, then brought his hand to his own chest. Home, self-duty. Then he stepped forward and rested his massive hand, just for a moment, over my heart. It was a thank you, and it was a goodbye. I never saw them again. I retired in 2016. But to this day, I still leave apples and nuts on a moss-covered stump deep in Silver Lode Canyon, and they're always gone by morning. Some secrets aren't meant to be solved, only honored. This is only one story in my grandfather's secret journal. If you like this story and want to hear more, please let me know in the comments and subscribe. I'll put more entries out if people enjoyed my grandfather's secret legacy.